Gunshots echoed through a quiet Athens neighborhood just after 9:30 a.m. on December 3rd, 2020. Residents later said it didn't sound like a gunfight. It sounded like a decision, quick, deliberate, spaced just far enough apart that each shot carried its own message. A few people opened their blinds. One person dialed 911, and somewhere behind the homes on Westchester Circle, a 15-year-old boy lay bleeding in the woods, his life ending before anyone even realized he was missing. His name was Keyshawn Gaynor, a former Cedar Shoals High School student, a teenager who had left home that morning like it was any other day. But the moment officers arrived, that illusion collapsed. Behind a fence at the edge of the tree line, they found him motionless on the cold ground, his body positioned as if he'd been reaching forward, his arms extended, a phone under him, shell casings beside him, and a wound along his neck, so severe the officer's report described it as a gouge, exposing muscle, surrounded by additional gunshot wounds to the head and upper chest. There was no screaming when police arrived, no frantic call for help, only the quiet of a neighborhood that had been jolted awake. The first officers on scene quickly realized they weren't responding to a rescue. They were securing a homicide, and someone, whoever pulled the trigger, was already gone. Word traveled through Athens faster than the crime scene tape could be stretched. The crowd that formed at the edge of the woods didn't come slowly. It poured in. Neighbors, cousins, friends, people from the apartment complex, people who heard the sirens and ran. And then, pushing through that crowd with the panic of a man who already knows the truth, came Keyshawn's father. Body cam footage captured the moment he understood what had happened. Officers held him back, pleading with him not to cross the tape. But grief doesn't listen. It only moves. He pushed forward again and again, begging to see his son, shouting that this was his boy, that this wasn't happening. Officers told him what every parent in that situation has heard. This is not the last memory you want. But it didn't matter. No father is built to hear that his child is gone. While the chaos grew outside the perimeter, detectives began doing the only thing they could. Start with what was there: a backpack, a phone, a wallet with no cash, a scale, a mask, a handful of personal items. At the time, none of it seemed significant. But as investigators would later discover, that backpack was a thread that held the entire case together. For now, all they knew was that a 15-year-old boy had been executed in broad daylight, less than 100 yards from where he lived. And someone in this neighborhood, maybe standing in the crowd right now, knew exactly why. As officers searched the woods, one woman stepped forward, a neighbor named Eugenia. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't guessing. She had seen something. From her upstairs window overlooking the tree line, she watched a man emerge from the woods moments after the gunshots. He moved quickly. He was masked. He held something metallic in his hand, something she believed was a gun. And he didn't run. He walked straight into a nearby house, stayed less than 5 minutes, changed some of his clothing, and left again with another person. The moment she pointed toward the house, officers recognized it immediately. A boy who lived there, Layman Bubba Williams, had once been close to Keyshawn. Their friendship had fallen apart in the months before the shooting. No one knew why. No one had tried to find out. Until now, within minutes, that house became the center of the investigation. Inside were teens pacing, arguing, and insisting they knew nothing. But outside, the crowd was growing restless. The longer detectives held the scene, the more grief started curving into something dangerous. Threats formed in the air, rage mixed with loss. Relatives shouted that they knew who did it, and that police needed to act before they did. Officers tried to calm the neighborhood, but the tension was unmistakable. Somebody here was going to talk, or somebody here was going to take revenge. When detectives approached Bubba, he didn't run. He walked out with hands shaking, a fresh bruise under his eye. Officers noticed immediately. They asked about it. He said he hit a pole. They didn't believe him. They started asking questions about the woods, about Keyshawn, about the gunshots. And then came the moment that cracked the case open, not because Bubba confessed, but because he didn't. He said something else instead, something the officers weren't expecting. He wasn't alone in the woods. There were two others. He wouldn't name them yet. He was scared. He contradicted himself. He lied, then corrected himself. Officers pressed him using a tactic known as minimization, suggesting the shooting could have been self-defense, an attempt to coax a truthful version of events. But Bubba didn't budge. He didn't admit to shooting anyone. He didn't describe firing a gun. He didn't place himself at the trigger, but he knew who did. His silence wasn't a denial. It was a shield for someone else. Back at the crime scene, another breakthrough emerged, not from the suspect, but from Keyshawn's own family. His father, still overcome with grief, gave detectives 2 names he'd been sent by relatives, the names of people his family believed were involved. 2 names Keyshawn himself had reportedly recognized from a photo as people he'd argued with before. Those names were Kenya KT Yerby and DeCoin Faust. And when detectives took that new information back to Eugenia for a formal photo lineup, her answer confirmed it. She pointed directly at KT. She said she saw him in the passenger seat of the red SUV that morning. She said DeCoin was driving. Now detectives had the pieces they needed: a witness, 2 suspects, and a motive beginning to form. All that was left was to find the men themselves and understand why a conflict between teenagers had escalated into a daytime execution in the woods. But when police went looking for Kenya and DeCoin, they found something else first. Something in the apartment of a woman named Raven Bennett, tied to the red SUV Eugenia had described. Something nobody had expected: a hidden stash of weapons. And one of them was the gun that killed Keyshawn. According to forensic tests later performed by investigators, the shell casings found near Keyshawn's body matched a 9mm pistol recovered inside Raven's apartment. According to questioning, Kenya and DeCoin showed up at her home right after the shooting, arriving in the red SUV Eugenia saw, and one of them left that gun behind. The case was no longer about teenagers fighting. It was about concealment, transportation, disposal, and a weapon that moved from the woods straight into someone else's home. The story of how Keyshawn died was now spreading across 3 houses: 2 suspects, a witness, and a handgun tied together by a single thread. The backpack found under Keyshawn's body. A bag one person claimed he stole. A bag another person claimed he wanted back. A bag that, according to interviews used in this investigation, was supposed to contain cash and pills. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It was a grudge. And the moment KT and DeCoin went into those woods, that grudge became a death sentence. This is a story of how police unraveled it. The moment detectives left the crime scene, their attention narrowed to a single detail that had surfaced again and again: the vehicle. A witness had glimpsed a dark red SUV waiting quietly near the wood line just moments after the gunfire. It wasn't peeling out of the neighborhood or racing down the street. It idled like someone was timing their escape, not fleeing in panic. Detectives broke into teams, circling the surrounding blocks and weaving to the maze of streets that wrapped around Westchester Circle. In neighborhoods like this, abandoned cars blend into background. A vehicle can sit untouched for days without anyone noticing. But it didn't take long before they found exactly what they were looking for. Parked under the thin winter shade, a red SUV sat at a crooked angle, as if the driver left in a hurry. It matched the description perfectly. When officers ran the plates, a new name entered the case: Raven Bennett. Though she had never appeared in the early confusion at the scene, her connection mattered immediately. According to police interviews used in this investigation, she was closely connected to DeCoin Faust, the young man witnesses placed in the driver's seat that morning. Detectives approached her apartment with a growing sense that they were walking directly into the next chapter of the story. When Raven opened the door, she wasn't angry or defiant. She was confused, tired, caught between curiosity and fear. Detectives asked if she had seen DeCoin that day. She said no. They asked about the SUV. She hesitated. They asked if she knew why police were knocking. She shook her head. Her answers lacked something detectives had learned to watch for. Not honesty, intention. She wasn't lying to deceive them. She was lying to protect someone. She allowed them inside. The apartment appeared normal. Children's toys, laundry, the clutter of everyday life. Nothing about it suggested 2 murder suspects had recently walked through the door. But when detectives opened a closet in her children's bedroom, the tone of the investigation changed instantly. Inside were multiple firearms, a chopped AK-style rifle, a modified pistol, magazines loaded with ammunition, parts from other weapons. These weren't hunting rifles or old family heirlooms. These are the kind of guns people hide when they cannot legally own them. And in Raven's case, she couldn't legally own any firearm at all, much less several hidden in a child's closet. When detectives carried the weapons into the living room and laid them on the carpet, the color drained from her face. She denied knowing about them. She insisted they weren't hers. She claimed she didn't store anything for anyone, but detectives noticed the cracks forming in her voice. She faltered at questions she couldn't dodge. Her eyes darted toward the floor. When asked who used the SUV, pressure built and her resolve slipped. At last, she admitted the guns belonged to DeCoin. That small admission was not small at all. It linked the SUV to the guns, and the guns of men last seen leaving the woods. Detectives seized the weapons immediately. Forensics began testing them the moment they arrived at the lab. The 9mm handgun was the priority. The ballistic comparison didn't take long. The shell casings recovered from the woods matched the casings test fired from the handgun found in Raven's closet. This was the gun that killed Keyshawn. And according to the investigative interviews, it had passed through the hands of DeCoin and KT before landing inside Raven's apartment. While the lab confirmed the match, the second detective team was questioning Kenya Yerby's girlfriend at her home. She, too, seemed overwhelmed. She, too, claimed she had no idea where KT was. She, too, insisted there had been a breakup and that she was uninvolved. Detectives recognized the pattern immediately. Everyone connected to KT, and DeCoin was suddenly confused, emotional, or feigning distance. No one claimed to know anything. Yet the evidence tightening around these two men was undeniable. By the time detectives regrouped, they had a timeline emerging from multiple sources. Body cam footage, witness statements, and interviews conducted in the hours following the shooting. Keyshawn had been confronted in the woods. Two men left that scene. One of them carried something metallic the witness believed was a gun. Those men entered a house for only minutes. They emerged and got into a red SUV. That SUV appeared at Raven's apartment shortly after. And inside that apartment, police recovered the murder weapon. Nothing about the case depended on rumor or speculation anymore. Every link in the chain was physical, traceable, and corroborated. But something still puzzled detectives. The weapon was found. The car was found. People connected to both were found. Yet the two central figures at the heart of the investigation were missing. KT had vanished into confusion. DeCoin seemed to drift in and out of places before officers arrived. The case could not move forward without them. Detectives doubled back through the neighborhood. They revisited Bubba. They scrutinized timelines minute by minute. They retraced each movement that morning. And as they reconstructed the story, a chilling realization settled in. The shooting of a 15-year-old boy had begun over something small, sudden, and stupid, an accusation about a backpack that spiraled into a death that no one could take back. But the part that concerned detectives most wasn't the shooting itself. It was what happened afterward. The quick change of clothing, the short stop inside Bubba's house, the immediate disposal of the weapon, the attempt to leave their tracks scattered across different homes. This wasn't the frantic chaos of teenagers shocked by what they'd done. It was a quiet method of two young men already familiar with hiding wrongdoing. The story was no longer driven only by what happened in the woods. It was now driven by what KT and DeCoin were willing to do to keep that morning from being traced back to them. Detectives didn't know it yet, but they were closing in, because while KT believed he could control what police learned, and DeCoin believed he could slip through the cracks, the evidence had already given investigators everything they needed. All that remained was to find the two of them and force the truth into the light. Detectives had the SUV. They had the gun. They had an eyewitness. But they still didn't have the one thing an investigation like this depends on: the truth, not the stories told on front porches, not the fragments whispered between relatives, not the rumors spreading through the neighborhood. They needed the version spoken behind a closed door, where fear replaces pride and reality replaces loyalty. The first person they brought, and wasn't KT. It wasn't even DeCoin. It was a boy whose home both suspects had entered minutes after shooting. Layman Bubba Williams. When detectives escorted him around the side of the house that first afternoon, he was already unraveling. His hands trembled. His voice wavered. He kept glancing toward the woods, as if the guilt might emerge from between pines. And the bruise under his eye, deep purple, swollen, told a story he wasn't ready to share. Detectives began gently. They needed him talking. If someone attacked you, one detective told him, if you defended yourself, that changes everything. It was a classic approach. Lower the stakes. Offer a justification. Give the suspect a version of events they can breathe inside. But Bubba didn't take it. He shook his head, insisting he never touched a gun, never fired anything, never walked into the woods. His story came out in broken threads, full of half-answers and contradictions. He said he had been with his mother. He said he left the neighborhood. Then he said he didn't. Then he changed his mind again. The detective didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten him. He simply told him something Bubba hadn't considered. If you weren't involved, then whoever was is still out there, and they think you're the one we're looking at. Fear flickered across Bubba's eyes. He looked away from the detective, swallowing hard. And then came the moment detectives had been waiting for. There were two people, Bubba said quietly. Two people in the woods with Keyshawn. He wouldn't say their names yet, but the number was enough. It aligned with the witness. It aligned with the SUV. It aligned with the forensic trail forming around Raven's apartment. Bubba had just confirmed the crime was not a lone act. It was a partnership. The interview didn't last much longer. Bubba never confessed. He never placed himself at the trigger. What he did, unknowingly, was confirm that detectives were no longer searching for a suspect. They were searching for two. The next conversation would come from a far more emotional place. While detectives pieced together the interview timeline, Keyshawn's father approached them with information of his own. In the crowd at the crime scene, relatives had been sending him names, screenshots, pictures, anything they thought might matter. He handed detectives two photos. One of the faces belonged to Kenya KT Yerby. The other, he believed, was connected as well. Detectives needed verification, and there was only one person who could give it to them, Eugenia. When they brought the photo lineup to her home, she didn't hesitate. She didn't squint or guess or apologize the way unsure witnesses often do. Her finger landed on KT's photo almost immediately. This, she said, was the boy in the passenger seat. This was the one she saw emerging from the trees. And yes, she could identify him again. The witness was solid. The forensic weapon match was solid. The SUV connection was solid. All that remained was locating the men themselves. Detectives began searching the addresses tied to both suspects. They went to KT's girlfriend's apartment. They questioned her about the morning. She said she didn't know anything. She said they had just gone through a breakup. She said she hadn't seen him since yesterday. But detectives recognized the same subtle pattern they had seen with Raven. Too many pauses. Too much rehearsed confusion. Too many I don't knows that sounded like the exact opposite. They pressed her harder. She kept insisting KT had left her life before the shooting, but her behavior revealed something else entirely. She was afraid to tell them where he was. Meanwhile, the unit at Raven's apartment was moving forward in a different direction. After finding the hidden guns, they needed to determine how they arrived there, and whether she had knowingly assisted the suspects after the murder. She attempted to distance herself, but every answer she gave pulled her closer. When detectives asked who might have access to guns, she said, "My child's father." When they asked if he had stored anything there, she said no. When they asked again later, she said, "Maybe." When they asked if she would take a polygraph, she refused. Her refusal wasn't what made detectives suspicious. It was the timing. How quickly she offered to take one, then rejected it when they asked if she meant it. That shift told them something. She was terrified of what the results would show. As they continued pressing her, another detail emerged. The red SUV she claimed had no insurance and hadn't moved for days had in fact been seen driving away from the apartment not long after shooting. And Raven herself admitted that DeCoin had been at her home earlier that day. The threads were tightening. Every lie clarified the truth. Every hesitation revealed the timeline. Detectives were now certain. KT and DeCoin had shown up in that SUV after the shooting. They had brought the murder weapon inside before leaving it behind. And Raven had at least some level of involvement, whether by choice, loyalty, or fear. But despite all of this, both suspects were still missing. That changed sooner than anyone expected. Detectives located DeCoin first, not in a distant county or hiding at a friend's home. He was at Raven's apartment, the same place where the murder weapon had been found. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply walked out the door, as if he had been waiting for the moment to arrive. His arrest opened the door to the next stage of the investigation, the interviews that would determine how the story unfolded. When detectives brought him in, he didn't appear cold or detached. He looked tired, not like someone who felt guilty, but like someone who knew the day had finally caught up to him. He didn't deny being with KT that morning, but he claimed he wasn't in the woods. He tried to distance himself from the shots, from the motive, from the decision to pull the trigger. But detectives recognize the language of self-preservation. When a story avoids the center too deliberately, it circles the truth. They knew they needed KT. When Keyshawn's father provided the name Kenya, he said it with a kind of certainty police don't ignore. People in the neighborhood had already connected the dots long before detectives knocked on any doors. They had whispered the name to each other before police even arrived. They had posted it in comments, sent it to family members, texted it among themselves. To them, KT wasn't a mystery. He was the only one who made sense. Detectives finally located him with the help of a family intermediary and brought him in for questioning. He walked in with the confidence of someone who thought he knew what detectives knew and thought he could work around it. But he underestimated the amount of evidence recovered in the last 48 hours. He underestimated the witness who watched him from her upstairs window. He underestimated the gun found in Raven's apartment. And most of all, he underestimated the forensic trail that tied everything together. When detectives entered the room, they didn't begin with accusations. They began with a simple premise. If this was self-defense, now was the time to say it. If there had been a fight, this was the moment to explain it. If something happened that wasn't intentional, this was his last chance to give context before the physical evidence interpreted it for him. KT insisted he had nothing to do with the shooting. He said he wasn't there. He said he didn't have a gun. But detectives kept circling back to the same question. Why did multiple people place him in the woods? Why did the witness identify him? Why did the gun tied to the murder end up inside Raven's apartment after he arrived there? Each time he answered, he gave them something new, a contradiction, a misplaced detail, a fragment that didn't match the others. And then, almost without realizing it, KT made the mistake detectives had been waiting for. He described details about the confrontation in the woods. Details no one outside that moment could possibly know. Details only one of two people could have described. By trying to minimize his role, he revealed he had been present. And in that instant, detectives had exactly what they needed. The case had unfolded in stages. Each witness, each interview, each gun, each lie layering itself over the last. But when KT finally slipped, everything came together. Now detectives could see the full outline of what happened that morning. It began with a backpack. It escalated with a grudge. It ended with 6 shots in the woods and a frantic scramble to hide the aftermath. What remained was understanding how the confrontation began and how a teenage argument turned into an execution before anyone in that neighborhood realized it was happening. Long before the gunshots echoed through the woods behind Westchester Circle, the story had already begun unraveling. It didn't start with violence or threats or any deep feud between teenagers. It began with something far smaller, something no one would have believed could lead to murder. A backpack, that single detail, discovered beneath Keyshawn's body, would eventually expose every layer of resentment, paranoia, and impulsive anger that fused together on the morning of December 3rd, 2020. As investigators pieced the case together, a recurring name surfaced in almost every statement: KT. According to interviews, KT believed the contents of that backpack belonged to him, cash, pills, and personal items he claimed Keyshawn had taken. Whether the accusations were true didn't matter. In the world these boys navigated, perception carried more weight than evidence. A stolen backpack was an inconvenience. It was a challenge, a public insult, something that demanded a response. But KT wasn't looking for the legal kind of justice. He wanted to confront the person he believed betrayed him, and for that, he needed someone who wouldn't question his motives, someone who would follow without hesitation, someone like the driver of the red SUV. People close to the case described the driver as unflinching, quiet, loyal, willing to put himself into situations without demanding explanations. A ride here, a favor there. The kind of person whose silence is interpreted as agreement. In the hours leading up to the shooting, investigators learned that KT and the driver were together, planning the confrontation that would take them into the woods that morning. The woods behind the neighborhood were dense and uneven, a place teenagers often use as a shortcut, but rarely as a meeting point. On that cold December morning, the sun barely hung above the tree line as Keyshawn walked toward the area. For reasons left unclear in the interviews, he agreed to meet there. Whether he was lured, threatened, or believed he could talk his way out of the situation remains one of the unanswered questions of the case. What detectives do know comes from fragments revealed during interviews, moments described indirectly, details implied rather than confessed. According to KT's account, the confrontation was immediate. Words were exchanged, voices rose, and somewhere in those tense moments, the argument bent sharply into panic. Teenagers don't always understand consequence. They don't always see the seconds slipping away from them. What began as anger became fear, and fear became irreversible violence. Investigators believe Keyshawn tried to run. The location of the shell casings, the pattern of the wounds, the position of his body, everything suggested he was moving when the gunfire began. He was struck multiple times across the torso and once fatally in the head. The shots were close range, precise enough to suggest the shooter was only feet away. The gunfire echoed across the trees, bouncing to the yards of Westchester Circle. Eugenia, the witness, heard the blast from her home. By the time she rushed to her window, she saw a masked figure sprinting from the trees, holding something metallic before tucking it into his jacket pocket. His stride was fast, deliberate, his head low. No hesitation, no pause, no sign of looking back. He disappeared into a nearby house. It belonged to a family whose son had once been close friends with Keyshawn. Inside, the masked figure stayed for only a few minutes, just long enough to remove outer clothing, adjust himself, and prepare for the next step. He exited again with another person and climbed into the red SUV waiting out front. The SUV didn't linger. It pulled off quickly and disappeared from sight, leaving behind only silence and a dying 15-year-old lying behind a fence line, unseen by anyone who might have reached him in time. The investigation into the red SUV uncovered more answers. According to interviews, the vehicle was driven directly to the home of someone close to both KT and the driver. It was parked hidden and left untouched, as if its owner believed distance alone could erase its role in the morning's events. What they didn't anticipate was a witness who had memorized the vehicle's color and shape. They didn't anticipate officers canvassing the area within minutes of the shooting. And they certainly didn't anticipate what detectives would find inside the home where the vehicle was eventually located. The discovery of firearms in that home changed everything. These weren't hunting rifles or inherited heirlooms. They were weapons meant to disappear. One of them, a 9mm pistol, was matched through ballistics to the bullets that killed Keyshawn. The moment that report came back, the confrontation in the woods transformed from rumor to corroborated homicide. And yet, even with the weapon identified and the witness placing the suspect together, detectives still needed to understand why the argument had escalated to murder. No feud between teenagers begins and ends with a single backpack. Something deeper was at play. Fear, pride, the pressure to prove oneself, the instinct to retaliate before appearing weak. When detectives finally spoke to KT again, they pressed him gently but firmly. They weren't looking for a confession. They were looking for clarity. He denied being in the woods, denied pulling the trigger, denied knowing anything about the weapon found in the apartment. But then, in explaining the situation, He referenced details only someone present at the confrontation could have known. It wasn't a slip of guilt. It was a slip of presence, a moment when his story became too informed to be innocent. Interviews with those in the neighborhood filled in the rest of the puzzle. People described the tension between KT and Keyshawn in the days before the shooting. The missing backpack, the whispering among teenagers who knew what was brewing, the expectation that someone would confront someone else before it was over. No one anticipated where it would lead. What happened in those woods wasn't a professional hit or a predatory ambush. It was a kind of impulsive violence that grows quietly in neighborhoods where disputes simmer beneath the surface and young people handle conflict without guidance or fear of consequence. One moment of rage, a weapon within reach, and a split-second decision that could never be reversed. By the time detectives reconstructed the timeline, the tragedy was painfully clear. Keyshawn didn't die because of a criminal empire or organized dispute. He died because one teenager believed another had disrespected him, and instead of choosing restraint, he walked into the woods armed and angry. Nothing in that motive made sense to the adults who loved these boys. Nothing justified the execution-style ending. Nothing restored the life that was taken, or the futures destroyed alongside it. But for detectives, the motive, however senseless, was finally understood. And with that understanding came the next and final step of the investigation. Turning motive into charges, and turning charges into justice for a boy whose life ended before he ever had the chance to outgrow the mistakes of others. By the time detectives finished assembling the fragments of that morning, the story no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a slow-moving catastrophe that dozens of people had seen pieces of, but no one had fully understood until it was far too late. Every interview, every photo, every trace of evidence brought the investigation closer to a single unavoidable conclusion. The shooting of Keyshawn wasn't random, and it wasn't accidental. It was intentional, personal, and preventable. When officers arrived at the home where the driver had been staying, there was no chase, no barricade, no scene. He was sitting quietly inside, surrounded by the normal sounds of a regular day, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Investigators let him out calmly. He didn't resist. He didn't ask what this was about. That silence became the first real answer detectives received from him. The forensic results from the weapon recovered in the apartment struck the final blow against any possibility of misunderstanding. The 9mm pistol had been test-fired, and its markings matched the rounds removed from Keyshawn's body. The science was definitive. Whatever story anyone offered after that point could no longer override what the physical evidence had already confirmed. But even science has limits. For detectives to formally close the case, they needed the account of those who had been closest to the suspects. They needed cooperation, or something close enough to it. When officers brought KT in again, they didn't challenge him with photographs or accuse him of lying. They let the silence sit between them and waited. And in that silence, KT revealed the truth he hadn't intended to share. He spoke about the argument. He spoke about the bag. He spoke about the confrontation in the woods. He didn't describe pulling a trigger, but the details he offered were details only someone present could have known. It wasn't a confession. It was confirmation. His presence at the scene, something he had denied since the moment detectives first made contact, was now undeniable. Once that line was crossed, the rest moved quickly. Kenya KT Yerby was charged with murder. The driver of the red SUV was charged with felony murder, possession of a firearm during a violent crime, and assisting after fact. Raven, the woman whose apartment had become the final stop of the gun in the vehicle, was charged with hindering apprehension and tampering with evidence. The person whom many in the neighborhood had initially suspected, Bubba, was cleared entirely. His lies had been self-protective, not malicious, and detectives found no evidence connecting him to the shooting. He was a witness caught in the gravitational pull of a crime he didn't commit but couldn't avoid. With charges filed, the investigation transitioned from the detectives' hands into the courts. But for the neighborhood, nothing was over. The tape was gone. The officers had left. The woods were quiet again. Yet the grief lingered like a bruise that wouldn't fade. In the days that followed, Keyshawn's family replayed the single truth that shattered them. A 15-year-old boy had walked into the woods and had never walked back out. Parents who had raised sons and daughters in that same neighborhood now looked at the tree line differently. What had been a shortcut became a reminder of how quickly teenagers could get swept into danger. For the families of the charged young men, the aftermath was its own kind of devastation. They had to face the fact that choices made in seconds could destroy entire futures. They had to face the whispered question from neighbors, the sideways glances from people who couldn't separate the crime from the family members left behind. In the interrogation rooms, detectives reflected on the case with a quiet understanding familiar to anyone who had worked homicides involving kids. There were no masterminds here, no hardened criminals with decades of experience. Just teenagers. Teenagers with tempers, teenagers with egos, teenagers with access to guns, teenagers who didn't understand how final a single moment can be. When the courtroom proceedings began, the formal language of the law replaced the raw emotion of the interviews. Attorneys talked about intent, responsibility, evidence, and consequences. Photographs were entered into the record. Statements were read aloud. The red SUV became exhibit. The gun became exhibit. The backpack became exhibit. Everything that had once belonged to living people was transformed into pieces of a legal puzzle. But the heart of the case wasn't found in the exhibits. It lived in the words of the father who arrived at the scene that morning and collapsed when he learned the truth. It lived in the terrified witness who watched a masked figure flee through her backyard. It lived in the frightened stammering of teenagers caught between loyalty and law. No sentence could bring back the boy who died in the woods. No verdict could undo the chain of decisions that led to the gunfire. But accountability mattered. And for Keyshawn's family, knowing that the people responsible would face the consequences was the only step forward left to take. In the final report filed by investigators, the motive section is striking in its simplicity. A stolen bag, rumors, a grudge, hurt pride, misplaced anger, a gun, a moment that ended one life and derailed several more. Tragedies like this rarely come from grand narratives or elaborate plots. Most begin quietly, in misunderstandings and unresolved arguments, in the short tempers of young men trying to prove themselves. And when those worlds collide with firearms, the outcomes are irreversible. As the case moved into the slow, procedural world of the court system, the streets of Athens finally began to settle. But the memory of that morning didn't fade. It lingered in the woods, in the houses that lined Westchester Circle, and in the lives of families forever marked by a crime that never should have happened. For detectives, the story ended with the charges. For the neighborhood, it ended with silence. For Keyshawn's family, it will never end at all.